5 weeks ago, I planted my balcony garden of herbs and green vegetables. The first week was absolutely serene as I watched my green creatures grow. In this unexpectedly dramatic follow-up video, I'll show you how everything went pretty downhill due to my own foolishness and disregard for the science-based and time-honored tradition of planting on or just after planting weekend. It's really in the name. This is a lesson that I already knew, but had to learn again, and hopefully this time it sticks. As you may recall from my previous balcony garden video, I was bursting at the seams with excitement about planting my garden this year. Like a bit of a tool, I danced my way to the fruit market weeks ahead of schedule and began planting more than a week before planting weekend. I don't live in California or Florida or Arizona or anywhere hot. I live in Toronto, a place with 4 distinct seasons, one of them being frosty. It should have come as no surprise when I woke up one morning to find it was ice raining outside. I was nervous, but last year's garden withstood a hailstorm and came out okay. So I decided to just keep tabs on the situation and watch it closely. But suddenly it was snowing. The plants were covered in icy water. The soil and pots were freezing cold. The soil was eroding from the wind, and I was having an emotional breakdown while scrambling to keep it all together. This is where we get to the part about planting weekend being rooted in science. Notoriously, the May-long weekend in Ontario can either be gorgeous and sunny, or it can be absolutely freezing cold. You really never know which way it's going to go, which is why it can be detrimental to the life of your garden. After this weekend, the weather typically mellows out and becomes much warmer and sunnier, which is ideal for gardening. Planting after the May-long weekend means you will avoid planting just before a potential brief but fateful cold snap. I moved the pots under shelter and let them rest safe from wind or more snow and ice, but much damage had already been done. The dill was uprooted and every single plant looked miserable and so sad. At this point, the damage had been done and all I could do was watch as my plants bravely suffered the harrowing weather. I stood there feeling immense shame and guilt at what I had done. A second year in a row, because I did this last year too. All I could do was hope and pray that the garden wasn't completely ruined and dream of a second chance to make it right with these creatures that I had brought into my home. Little did I know what was coming next. The following day, I was in full-on recovery mode. I bought another bag of potting soil and got to work repairing the soil erosion that had taken place. What I could not recover from was the feeling of total embarrassment at having made such a stupid rookie mistake. My ego was pretty bruised. The rain was so icy and was coming down so hard that it had aggressively splashed soil right out of the pots and all over the balcony. I could feel that the pots and the soil were still very cold to the touch, even though it had been 24 hours since the storm. And you'll never believe what I discovered next. A few days after I had made the soil repairs and everything seemed to be doing well, I noticed a foamy texture on the soil of some of my tropical plants. I do have a few tropical plants that I haven't talked about yet because they usually live inside my home, but I had unfortunately put them outside just before the storm. That week was not my finest. I took a closer look at the other plants and discovered that several pots had developed fuzzy white mold. I started freaking out and trying to Google what could have caused this to happen, and I discovered 2 potential reasons, and I think it was a combination of both in this case. The first was that I had used a bag of old soil that was improperly stored. You may remember my video about how I properly stored my pots and composted my plants and soil last year so that they wouldn't get funky and moldy over the winter due to frosting and then defrosting in a confined place that receives little sunlight to dry it out. Well, even though I did all that back-breaking legwork to scrub and preserve my pots. I rather stupidly left a sealed plastic bag of soil outside all winter long and still decided to use it, meaning it had frosted and then defrosted inside a plastic bag, meaning that mold was just waiting to explode all over my plants. And the second trigger was the frost exposure, which froze the soil and did not allow it to drain properly for several days, creating an ideal growing condition for mold. Upon this realization, I was in complete agony, and again, the word of the day is foolishness. I began salvaging the affected plants, starting with green Swiss chard. The leaves were rotting and the stalks were breaking with every touch, but I still could not accept that the plant was already deceased. Cue my intense emotional upset. The Swiss chard was gone. I had lost it. Mold was rampant throughout the leaves, stalks, and roots, and was found inches down in the soil. It even smelled funky like mold. I bid the plant a heartfelt farewell and tossed it into a compostable garbage bag, along with the entirety of the soil it had once lived in. The silver lining in this scenario is that only the plants who had received the old soil had turned moldy. The rest of the garden was recovering just fine. I shifted my attention to the two tropical plants. They are hardier than Swiss chard and have been in my home for much longer. The painter's palette lily is actually inhabited by the spirit of one of my grandfathers and keeps me company every day. And it had persevered despite the frost, mold, and lack of drainage offered in this beautiful concrete pineapple pot from Anthropology that looks pretty but is extremely impractical. Even though this plant is several years old, I had topped it up with some of the infected soil while in a jaunty gardening mood. The pink plant, also known as Chinese evergreen, is only a couple years old and is in a pot with a drainage hole, but was covered in mold from root to pot. I felt so bad after leaving these plant babies outside in the frost that I had brought them inside and put them under a warm grow light to try to undo the damage I had done. You can see how all of this unfolded terribly, right? Provide mold-infected soil, perfect conditions for the spores to flourish, and then crank up the grow light and watch it all fall to pieces. Not my finest performance as a gardener. I know this sounds crazy, but I do believe that plants communicate with their owners. Have you ever felt alone when there's a plant next to you? I mean, unless you're totally heartless towards plants, I think the answer is no. My grandfather plant only started to sprout flowers years after owning it, when I quit my corporate job and started working from home and talking to it every day. I don't know if there's science behind it, but I feel my garden's presence in my heart, honestly. His roots were so tightly wound and gripping the pot that it was nearly impossible to wedge him free, and although it was painful for both of us, it was in his best long-term interest to get a wash and a change of soil. The root system revealed itself to be far more intricate and complex than the visible portion of the plant would allow you to see. While the plants were awaiting their squeaky clean new homes, I kept them in jugs of water to hold them upright and prevent them from drying out. I scraped as much infected soil off of them as possible before plunging them into their liquid hotels. These plants truly defied the odds and held their heads up proudly while they waited so patiently on my balcony. As I said, I don't know if there's anything factual behind this, but I felt that these two in memoriam plants were working really hard to stay there for me, while I was working really hard to fix their homes. I must be inclined towards wrecking my back over this garden because, once again, I found myself lugging the pots into my bathtub to scrub them clean using hot soapy water. When you live in an apartment or a condo, a lot of things take place in your bathtub aside from actual bathing. It's a very functional space. The lesson of planting after the May long weekend is now inked indelibly on my brain. It was a mistake I shall never repeat again. The idea here was to cleanse everything that had interacted with the mold, the pots, saucers, and the trowel, and to remove any lingering mold spores from the porous terracotta pots. If the spores are not cleansed properly, they could end up blighting the soil and the plants all over again, at which point I would close my balcony door and entomb the garden en situ, never to be touched again. I found myself faced with a clean slate. All I had to do was sweep up any remaining traces of struggle from the floor and toss them into yet another compostable bag. I took this opportunity to switch up who was living where. The grandfather plant could move to a larger unit, while the evergreen could nestle into the pretty but stupid pineapple pot. As I lifted the painter's palette lily inhabited by the spirit of my dead grandfather out of the water yet again, I took a moment to appreciate its complicated root system before stuffing it into the planter and covering it with fresh potting soil. It had held in there for me despite horrible conditions, and I was determined to give it a better chance going forward. The empty pot that once held the green Swiss chard now stood empty, so I filled it with cilantro, whom I felt could grow more vast if given the space to take root. It was a quick transplant, but one that the plant adapted to quite quickly, so thank God for that. Feeling like I was finally doing something right, I sat on the ground amongst my creatures and thought about how that was the worst way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Below me, I could see people at the park, people walking along the street, while I toiled away on my balcony, drenched in soapy water, hunched over the bathtub like an ogre, feeling like garbage about the decisions that had led me to that precise moment. But then it was over. Equilibrium had been restored, and I had learned a lesson I shall not soon forget. The garden can forgive if it wants to. And that is why you should always wait until after the May long weekend to plant your garden.